we want to thank Justin Sandifor from the Center for Global Development for coming to speak today in the 3ie-IFPRI seminar series. He's a research fellow at the Center for Global Development, which I just said, and has a PhD from Oxford. He's largely worked in Africa, both east and west, I guess not south, right? So Kenya, Tanzania, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and he's braver than me because I've noted that he's got an Afghanistan project going as well. We're lucky to have John Hodnott discussing the paper today from the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division here at IFPRI. And just to remind you of the structure, we're going to go for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll give John about 10 minutes to discuss. We can be a little flexible in terms of that timing. If you have questions and we get into a discussion, I'll just watch the time and sort of like a soccer referee add some time to that 45 minutes, and maybe I'll show you a +5 or something. Just kidding. Thanks, Justin. I'm turn over the mic to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. So this is, in addition to myself, a collaboration between a whole bunch of people. As you see, 5 authors, Tessa Bold and myself are the non-Kenyans, and then 3 of our Kenyan colleagues, Mwangi Kimeni, who's at Brookings now, Germano Mwabu, still at the University of Nairobi, is based in Kenya, and Alice Nganga, who's also based in Kenya. And the initiative, the desire to do this, the idea of doing this was really kind of came from our Kenyan colleagues originally. Okay, so as most of you in this audience are very aware, especially since this is officially a 3ie audience, there's been this giant trend towards randomized and rigorous impact evaluation in development economics. And this has contributed a lot to our knowledge of the causal effects that underlie the models that we're interested in. But it's also contributed to a sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit model of how policy change should happen. How should we go about improving educational effectiveness, health policy, agricultural productivity, and so on in the developing world? Well, there's a model there of we should go out and run small-scale pilots, find out what works, rigorously test them so that we know what works and we're confident in the causal claims that we're making. And then once we've identified what works, we should scale that up and roll it out so that it benefits a large number of people. That model rests on a lot of assumptions about the external validity of our experimental findings. And this paper basically tries to explore 2 dimensions of that external validity issue, building on a somewhat well-known example study. This is, I guess, replication in economics. When we started this project, we were all very careful to never use the word replication because we thought that was just, a nail in our coffin in terms of anybody caring about the paper. I think in the last few years, replication has become more widely accepted, so now we kind of embrace the term. But the paper is really inspired by a literature on contract teachers. The specific intervention that we're going to be looking at, that we're going to be kind of studies we're going to be replicating and trying to scale up, relate to the use of contract teachers in primary schools. So why do we think contract teachers might be beneficial? There are a number of reasons. One, you get more bodies in a classroom at relatively low cost. And the other main reason is that, at least this is a hypothesis, contract teachers, unlike civil service teachers, have renewable fixed-term contracts. This is probably a sensitive topic in the DC job market. Fixed-term renewable contracts, which may or may not be renewed, and thus dynamic incentives to perform, possibly stronger than the civil service. Okay, so in addition to a large number of non-experimental studies on the effect of contract teachers, there have been kind of 2 recent kind of well-known experimental studies. One, Karthik Muralidharan and Venkatesh Sundararaman, their study in AP, part of a study that many of you are familiar with, a long and ongoing experiment with many different cross-cutting interventions, one of them, though, being contract teachers, and they find this fairly large, significant positive effect of 0.15 standard deviations from putting a contract teacher in an Indian primary school. Interestingly, this is a combination. This is, dropping an extra teacher into a school. This combines both what I referred to as a pupil-teacher ratio effect and possibly these dynamic incentive effects that I referred to earlier. This is everything. This is just an extra teacher. And from non-experimental evidence, they estimate that the return to an additional civil service teacher is about the same, actually. And so it comes down to the advantage of contract teachers being cost, essentially, and them being much, much cheaper in AP. Okay, in contrast, the Duflo, Dupont, and Kramer study is probably the more particularly relevant for us because it's in Western Kenya, and we're going to be working in Kenya. And it's dated 2009. There's a more recent NBER version from 2012. Apart from being more geographically relevant to us, the study has one particular conceptual advantage over the AP study. They find a contract teacher effect of 0.21 standard deviations, but the experimental design lets them separate out the class size reduction effect from the incentive effects. They can also place civil service teachers. It's a little more complicated than that, but effectively they can identify the return to having an extra civil service teacher, and none of this comes from the class size effect in their sample. Entirely driven by the better performance of the contract teachers relative to civil service teachers. Okay, so, well, let me pause for a second. If we're interested in taking this, we began our engagement with the Ministry of Education in Kenya with our Kenyan co-authors, and the Ministry of Education, wasn't a proposal from us, was floating an idea that looked quite similar to this contract teacher proposal. There was a lot of fretting over the language, interns or contract teachers and so on, and so we started to think about what kind of evaluation we could do and what kinds of new issues would arise as this became a large-scale government project. And so two things that we're going to talk about here in this paper. The two main dimensions that we designed the experiment to address were basically geographic heterogeneity and institutional heterogeneity. This is, in the language of, I guess, the treatment effects literature, heterogeneous response on the part of the beneficiaries, the pupils, and this is going to be kind of differences in the treatment itself. On the left-hand side, we have, a map Kenya with different ethno-linguistic groups. Ethno-linguistic fractionalization is high, even by East African standards. And so if we have a result from, hypothetically, we could say if we have a result from one particular part of Western Kenya, you might think that the same results might not apply in the rest of Kenya. I think most of us trained as economists, especially the non-Kenyans, were kind of like, meh, I'm going to guess it's a good first-order approximation. I'm okay with that. Ministry of Education, much less okay with that assumption that things that work in Western Kenya are going to work in Northeastern. What gets talked about, I think, somewhat less is this issue of institutions. So as motivation, I have a little bar chart here. The budget of the Ministry of Education, this is circa 2008, I think. Money coming, foreign aid money going through non-governmental organizations, which is, if you go to any UDC or a development conference, you see hundreds of grad students and recent graduates doing impact evaluations, randomized trials often, of ways to improve public service delivery in different developing countries. And in many cases, and Alan mentioned I'm doing work in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and I would fit in this category too. We're doing small-scale pilots with international NGOs delivering foreign aid money and testing new ideas. Well, that's great. That's about $3 million for Kenyan education. Foreign aid is total for primary education in Kenya is about $16 million. 2008 went, well, I'm not sure if it's gone up since then. I won't say anything there. Total budget of the Ministry of Education, $731 million. In terms of going to scale, there's a lot that we can contribute from the foreign aid side intellectually, but in terms of where the actual scaling is going to happen in the current, regime, you're eventually going to have to work with these $731 million if you want to change national policy. All right, so we were designed, the experiment was designed to look at heterogeneity across these two dimensions. Note that neither of these are scale per se. This is geographic heterogeneity and this is institutional differences, governments versus NGOs. It's not scale per se. And against our will, we had to confront the issue of scale per se. Because as we tried to roll out an experimental evaluation in 192 schools, the Ministry of Finance pushed the Ministry of Education to go ahead and get this out now. And simultaneous with our experiment, 18,000 contract teachers are deployed across Kenya, of which we have very limited control. It took a long time for people in the Ministry of Education to realize our project and that project were not the same thing. That benefited us a little bit for a while. But so 18,000 teachers roll out, and what that does is really change, we're going to argue, the politics. An NGO can run an experiment with 100 teachers. The government can even run an experiment, maybe with 100 teachers, and fly under the radar of national politics. You roll out 18,000 contract teachers, and you literally, as this picture shows, have protests in the streets of Nairobi that shut down traffic in the Ministry of Education, and the project rolls to a halt. And so John had not lived through this with us because he was advising us for one of our donors. So the project grinds to a halt for a year while the court battles and the protests in the street go on about the contract teachers. This gives you a little bit, just as background on the economics here. The average salary for a civil service teacher in our baseline was about $260 a month. The average salary for somebody hired informally, this is outside our experiment, but just parents get together, Parent-Teacher Association, and hire a teacher, is about $56 a month. And the proposal here you'll see on his sign is for 10,000 shillings a month, which at the time was about $135. So about half of what his colleagues in the civil service were making, but more than double, nearly triple what his colleagues hired informally would be making. We can be kind of unkind and talk about, if you're protesting low wages in the street, mentioning that you're 7,000 shillings for house help, and since there is free primary education in Kenya and secondary education in Kenya, mentioning that you're going to spend 10,000 shillings on school fees to send your own children to private schools is probably at least a rhetorically bad move, I think, on the part of the union. Okay, so that's the politics. I should just be clear, we set up the experiment to study geographic heterogeneity and institutional heterogeneity. Scale is thrown at us, and everything that's going to follow, the institutional divide between government and the NGO, and the scale issue are collinear. Anything I say about the difference between NGOs and governments, I want to claim could equally be the difference between small-scale NGO and a large-scale government program. I can't formally, experimentally, separately identify the effect of working with government and the effect of being big and flying on the radar screen of the National Teachers Union. All right, and we can get into the details as we go along about how we're going to keep these 18,000 teachers from contaminating the randomization of our experiment. All right, how am I doing? With that as a long-winded introduction, there's actually very little to show you in terms of results, so we'll speed up here soon. The outline, we'll talk about the experimental design and the context a little more. I think the headline result is about this horse race between institutions, NGO, and the government. I'll talk a little bit about some more speculative stuff about what kinds of mechanisms might explain the different outcomes that we'll see, and then we'll turn back to the geographic heterogeneity point before I conclude. Okay, so this is our sample of 192 schools divided into 3 arms of 62 schools. Control, MOE is the Ministry of Education, and our NGO implementer is World Vision Kenya. The political demand was that we be in all 8 provinces of Kenya. We're not in every district. We're not formally a nationally representative sample. We chose non-randomly 14 districts where all of our partners could agree to work. So we've got 14 districts that are kind of spread across the country but are not a random sample of the country. And within those districts, we sampled from schools, since the intervention is to provide an extra teacher, we're sampling from schools whose baseline pupil-teacher ratio was above the median for their district. So in that sense, more deprived half of schools in these districts is our universe. And these are very different environments. We've got slum schools in Nairobi. We've got some relatively middle class urban schools in Nairobi. We've got things in eastern and northeastern that are very remote and are actually schools that pick up and move on a regular basis. And we've got a small sample. We've got one district, Tesso, which overlaps with the sample from the Duflo, Dupas, and Kramer study that we cited at the beginning. Oops, wrong. So I think this essentially repeats what I've just said. 8 provinces, 14 districts, random sampling of schools with PTR above the median, school level randomization, divided into those 3 groups. The intervention, okay, I should specify the details here. The intervention, because this is kind of key in terms of interpreting the size of our coefficients, we provide 1 additional teacher per school. Our contract teacher, who is on a fixed term contract, we'll talk about what the wage and the details in a minute, they're assigned to either grade or 2 randomly. We determine you either go to grade or grade 2. And the schools have 17 months of exposure to this teacher. The original goal was 2 years, and we'll talk a bit about how politics messed that up. What we can't do, what we don't do, is at the school level randomly assign who gets the contract teacher and who doesn't. So this is, for studying the underlying mechanisms within the school, what the Duflo, Dupas, and Kramer study can do is randomly assign children in terms of which teacher. Are they getting the existing civil service teacher, or are they getting the new contract teacher? We didn't have that level of managerial control over the implementation. And, for reasons of our whole kind of construct of validity that we're talking about here, we didn't want to intervene quite that heavy-handedly. So the school gets a teacher, it's just to go into, say, grade 2. You're requested to add an additional class. The instruction is that this not be a para-teacher that sits alongside. Create a new class in grade 2. But beyond that, however, if you want to track pupils, put the weak ones in one group and the strong ones in another, great. If you want to flip a coin, great. There's no enforcement beyond that. Yes? There's not a lot of deep thinking behind the choice of grades 2 and grade 3, partially out of a belief that there are kind of diminishing returns, that they, I don't want to use the term critical period programming too incorrectly here, but that the return to investing in human capital at earlier grades would be higher than at later grades. Part of it a very pragmatic concern that we had better testing quality in our baseline at grade 2 and grade 3. For a separate reason, we actually did test every grade in our baseline from 1 through 7, but we felt much more confident about the quality of our test instrument at lower grades than we did at upper grades. But these are all primary schools. These are all, and I should have specified just to be clear, these are all government primary schools, even when the NGO is intervening, all public primary schools, but no deep motivation beyond that of why grade 2 and grade 3 and not 7 or 8. Please.
Just in a sense, one of the things we talk about is looking at these very early in some sense, if you think about looking at this in fact, usually you have to much earlier on in the schools. And then the second thing
What he said. No. So we'll come to these details in a minute. But so our dependent variable is going to be standardized metrics of performance on a math and English exam administered by us, designed by the Kenyan National Examination Council. But we're going to use tests for a consistent cohort, or 2 cohorts actually, of pupils, not for the school at large, but for the cohorts that were the target group. So we're restricting ourselves, I shouldn't have probably even brought up that we did test other people. For the purposes here, we're focusing on this cohort of grade 2 or grade 3 pupils. Yeah? Yes. Okay, so 64 schools, the control group is easy. The control group, we do nothing. We only test them. At the end, we test them at the baseline, and we test them at the end. There were no other interventions going on in the control schools. They are government primary schools. Continue their regular business. And they may have gotten one of these, this is key, or to complicate matters. Well, let me I'll come back to this. So they get nothing. The government schools get a contract teacher who is administered by the Ministry of Education, paid by the Ministry of Education, employed through the Ministry of Education, etc. In the NGO treatment arm, the exact same salary, exact same contract terms, the exact same calendar, all the protocols the same. We do the same training for the people implementing, but everything is implemented for the program by World Vision and not by the Ministry of Education. So in principle, these get no teachers, and maybe should get one teacher each in these 64 schools. Okay, on top of this, we do have some cross-cutting interventions. Again, mimicking the Duflo et al. Study, Kenyan public primary schools have something called school management committees, especially since pre-primary education. These are an important institution. The government pays a capitation grant for each pupil to run the school. The school management committee is in charge of administering those funds. They are in a sense the board of the school. The head teacher is the chair. There are both teacher and parent representatives on there. And so we had a training intervention which was focused particularly on training the school management committee to enforce accountability on these contract teachers that we were bringing. They got general training in what a school management committee is and what it should be doing, but particularly about, you should be making sure these teachers show up. You're the ones employing these teachers. Hold them accountable. And that's only done that's half of the NGO treatment schools and half of the government treatment schools. Complicating matters, and I'm not going to talk much about this today, but I just want to acknowledge that it's going on in the background. We tried a couple of different protocols for how these teachers should be hired. Should the district education officer be in charge of screening applicants, choosing them and assigning them, or should local school management committees be in charge of the whole recruitment and payment process, actually? So we have kind of a fully decentralized process where the school management committee recruits the teacher, they get the money into the school bank account, they pay them, and we have a centralized system where it either goes to the World Vision office or to the district education office, and they implement everything. But again, that's cross-cut with the bigger NGO versus government issue. And then we have two salary levels. We have one salary level, which is 9,000 shillings, just below what the government ended up paying contract teachers, and another level, which is 5,000 shillings, so half of what the government was proposing to pay, and basically the market salary for an informal teacher in our baseline, a bit above, actually. So two salary levels. The timeline, just here's where things get messy. In principle, we have a baseline evaluation, we have the baseline survey where we test all the students. We're supposed to put these teachers into the schools, into the NGO and government treatment arm, and then we come back and do our final testing at the end. As you'll see, there's this big lag. We do our baseline in July 2009. We don't actually get the teachers into the schools until June 2010, because in the interim, there's the National Teachers Union files a lawsuit to stop the program. The Ministry of Education backs off. Everything slows down. So there's a year of, me flying back and forth to Kenya and achieving nothing there. And once the teachers are in place, almost simultaneously, instead of waiting for our evaluation of the government program, the ministry rolls out 18,000 contract teachers nationwide. So the key, the concern from just, never mind my, grand claims about external validity, internal validity suddenly becomes a big problem, right? If the ministry assigns the 18,000 contract teachers in response to where we are randomly assigning experimental teachers, then everything is sunk, right? They're treating our control group. So, I mean, luckily, the people running our project and the people doing this were the same people. It was literally the same steering committee. So we can do a couple of things. One, we can kind of offer documentary kind of narrative evidence that this didn't happen. It was, an acknowledged concern that we paid careful attention to through the process. And that actually the data that's used for the assignment of these contract teachers is lagged so far that it was a year before any of these things were known. And nobody making the decisions had knowledge, of our spreadsheet of where we were randomly assigning things. But also then we can go test. I've got some tables at the end of the slideshow if we get to that. We can test whether or not there's any difference in terms of did you get one of these 18,000 in the control group and the treatment group, in the government treatment arm or the NGO treatment arm. And there's no differences there. So we're pretty confident on that part. Politically relevant, though, is that towards the end, just a month before the thing winds up, if you're worried, one of the hypotheses we're going to get to is that, well, I'm a contract teacher, I'm working for an NGO, my contract's up in a year, that sucks, I better perform well. If I'm a contract teacher for the government, maybe I think, well, this is the Ministry of Education, I'm going to keep my job, the ministry doesn't fire people. Sure enough, the 18,000 contract teachers that were hired on fixed-term contracts are made permanent pensionable civil service, employees just before the end of this time. Doesn't apply formally to the people in our RCT, but may have been a strong signal to them what's going to happen. Yeah. Again, a little. Probably I should be. That's a very good question. I should be able to say more. So there are, somebody knows better, correct me, orders of magnitude, there are 20,000-ish government primary schools in Kenya. So this is nearly one contract teacher per school. This is a lot of teachers for Kenya. Again, this is spread across all grades. So 2 and 3 are going to get maybe a fourth of those at best. But there's a question of how much do they move the needle in terms of, if you believe that there is some diminishing return to extra teachers in terms of performance, it's going to move the baseline pupil-teacher ratio, the counterfactual pupil-teacher ratio down, and perhaps there's less room for improvement at that point. I should be able to tell you how much the pupil-teacher ratio changed. The ministry's own calculations, I think at the time, there's kind of a normative 40-to-1 pupil-teacher ratio that's ministry policy. It's just kind of dead letter. It's written. Nobody really, nothing they can do about it. But I think their estimate is that they needed at the time 60,000 new teachers to reach their target of 40-to-1. So this was a step towards that, but incomplete. And, I would add to that, if we believe, as we do, the mechanisms from the Duflo, Dupont, and Kramer paper, class size wasn't the point in the first place, right? The point was the different incentives that these teachers face. Okay, so results. Let's focus first on the horse race between, we tried the same program as best we could with an NGO and with the Ministry of Education. What did we get in terms of outcomes? So that's basically the paper in one slide. What is the ITT effect of being randomly assigned a contract teacher to your school on test scores for these second and third graders? This is with school fixed effects. What we get overall is a coefficient of about 0.08 standard deviations, which is, we can beat it into marginal significance. It's basically not quite significant in the overall sample. If you look separately at the NGO and the Ministry of Education treatment arms, we get something around 0.18 standard deviations, highly significant. Look at the MOE, most specifications, we get a point estimate that's actually negative, but entirely indistinguishable from 0. pause and spend half my time staring at that slide. That's about what I had to say. Yeah, question.
Okay, so I want to understand that. I mean, I'm looking at table 1, and it shows that primary reading exam score is 135, and the standard deviation of 5 over there. So when you talk about 1.15 standard deviation, that means around just 1 point. Do you think that increases any economic?
So this doesn't answer your question, but just to clarify, this is, we report, one of the things that we use in the balance calculations, and then we use it, was the school's performance, historical performance on the Kenya Certificate of Primary Exam Education leaving exam, basically that you take at the end of grade 8. That's not the exam we're looking at here. That's a different exam. That is the high-stakes official end of primary school exam. We're looking at an exam which was written by the same government agency that's in charge of that exam, but was designed to be appropriate to the curriculum of the grade levels we're working with. So somewhere in there should be, if there's not, I'm very worried, the means and standard deviations. Well, everything's normalized in the regressions, but there should be. How would I relate that to standard deviations on the KCPE? I'm not sure I can do that. I guess my only comment would be, in the literature on education interventions, an effect size of 0.2 standard deviations is generally considered, a good effect size, a successful program. And so what's happening here in the NGO arm is generally considered a good outcome. Of course, that good outcome should be, there should be some cost in that cost-benefit analysis, so we could compare to other interventions. I don't have a number for you for that. Okay. Unpacking this result a little bit. Why did the MOE arm go so awry? And before we get into sort of deeper mechanisms, one of the concerns is, I said this is an ITT effect, so intention to treat, these are all the schools that were supposed to get a contract teacher. Not all the schools that were supposed to get a contract teacher ever got a contract teacher. And there are a number of reasons for that. That could be bureaucratic screw-ups along the way, or it could be that the salaries, there's a long debate with our ministry colleagues about what the salary levels should be, and you don't basically guarantee that you're going to fill a vacancy with the salaries that we're paying. But one concern is that there's going to be a difference, that the NGO just managed to put teachers in schools and the ministry just didn't manage to put contract teachers in schools, and this becomes kind of an implementation failure of the most sort of mundane sort. So we can look at the labor supply of teachers. We've effectively randomized all these things on the labor demand side, and we can see how many teachers you get. So the unit of observation here is a teacher, it's basically a monthly vacancy. It's every school that is supposed to be treated times every month that they should have been treated. Sometimes you get a teacher for 6 months and then they walk away, and then you wait 3 months and you fill that vacancy again. So 2,000 plus treatment, vacancy months. Overall, about 75% of those were filled. 25% of them were not. If we look at the effective NGO implementation, it was about 12% higher, 69% on the government side, about 12% higher in the NGO side. And we did other things like, nearly doubling your salary meant about a 12% increase in the number of vacancies that we fill. Local recruitment was much more. These are all linear probability models, so some of these numbers probably add up to more than one. But if we do local versus central recruitment, we also get a big bump in terms of how successful they are at filling these vacancies, possibly with their cousins, but that's another issue. Okay, so does that difference here explain the difference in the treatment effect? So instead of showing you the bar charts, we can show you the regression results, and this is the thing to focus on. This is the result I showed you. Treatment effect, the IQT effect for the NGO side, 0.18, and the interaction between treatment and being in the government treatment arm reduces that down actually slightly below 0 if you add those up. If we now treat this as a local average treatment effect, the average treatment on the treated, we use the random assignment as an IV for actually having a teacher, then by construction, the point estimates go up a bit, but we're not doing anything to really explain away the difference here. All right, so that we can rule out, I think, that kind of simplest story for why the MOE side failed. Let's look at a range of other hypotheses. So this is simply a table of a survey of the teachers, the contract teachers who participated. These are, interviewing the treatment, in a sense. And we've got teachers who are in the government arm, the NGO arm, and is there a significant difference in column 3? And then we're doing something which, if you're an experimentalist, we're not allowed to do. We're going to say, is the change in scores in the school correlated with any of these completely endogenous characteristics of the teacher? Just to see which of these differences between teachers in the government and the NGO side might be hinting at a mechanism. Those of you who take mediation and mechanism stuff seriously can leave the room for a few minutes or laugh off this approach. I presented this in front of Mark Rosenzweig and Abhijit Banerjee. Abhijit Banerjee was asking questions like, talk to me about that coefficient, explain what it means, and Mark was yelling out, no, no, don't. So, okay, so we have first some simple teacher characteristics. Government and NGO, in terms of the number of people, I was somewhat surprised. I have no idea what to make of this. The government is much more likely to hire women. The government is, if anything, more likely to hire people with post-secondary education, and there's no difference in your professional qualifications. If you look, some of these are still personal characteristics, but if you look at a more local institution story, one of the Duflo, Dupas, and Kramer stories is about nepotism at the school level. And what do you know, if you compare the government and the NGO side, you get a big, significant difference in this crude measure of how much nepotism is going on in the hiring. A lot more nepotism in the government side. If you look at the correlation with value added on the test score, that's completely unrelated to what's happening in the test. So how much should we make of this? I'm not entirely sure. This is the opposite of absenteeism. This is not a random. This is like basically an announced. You should totally know we're coming to do this survey. Was the contract teacher even there? Only 63% of the cases in the government and 72% for the NGO, but no significant difference there. But there is a difference, even though it's not significant. Monitoring. Did anybody from the NGO or the government ever come to monitor the program? Some difference there, but again, not explaining outcomes. Things that do a little bit better explaining outcomes are what we want to attribute to failures at a grander level. So one is, we're calling national politics. One is salary delays. This is, I think, the average number of months that your paycheck was late during the program was 3 in the government treatment arm and over 2, but about 2 in the NGO arm. People waited a long time to get paid. Now, why did the government, this is a significant difference, and it significantly correlates with value added on the test. Why did the government do so poorly? I mean, lots of reasons. One of the reasons is that the Teacher Service Commission that normally does payroll for the ministry could not and would not, I think statutorily could not, participate in paying a contract teacher who was not a tenured civil service employee. So payroll had to be moved to a different office of the government in response to the strike action and the lawsuit, and the different office of the government that was running the payroll just didn't do very well. Right? So this is, in a sense, an artifact of somewhat unnatural conditions that goes against the spirit of what we're doing, but it was unnatural conditions that arose directly in response to the political pushback, on the streets, that the Teacher Service Commission wouldn't pay the salaries. We interview these people about, did you think that the union protests in the street was the union representing you? Legally, formally, it was not. You were not unionized. You were not to be covered. There's a significantly higher percentage of people who were in the government treatment arm who felt that the union was representing them, and that response correlates. If you think the union was representing you, your students did poorly. A report of whether you went to a union meeting doesn't have, there's a difference, and it's correlated negatively in the right direction, but it's not significant. So some hints at some of the national politics feeding in here. A different way of going at this is, do you identify with the union? Do you feel, this is actually the same question, phrase of, this is, was the union representing you as the dependent variable? And you were in a treatment school. The short story is, if you attended a union meeting and you were in the NGO arm, you're not really much more likely to think that the union represents you. If you attended a union meeting and you're in the government treatment arm, that convinced you, yes, the union represents me. If one of these 18,000 teachers, non-randomized teachers, landed in your school, did that make you believe that you were in the union? We hypothesized that it would, but the signs are in the right direction, that that's an insignificant result. If we turn to the test score gains, again we see if I attended a union meeting and only if I was in the government treatment arm, that seems to have negative implications for performance. If one of these other 18,000 teachers showed up in my school, that has negative implications for my performance only if I'm in the government treatment arm. So again, this is just hinting at a mechanism around the national politics inserting themselves within the experimental evaluation. Yep. Mm-hmm. I have to go look. It's a long question there, but we might. But that's I mean, there is a point there. If you go to a union meeting and you're employed in the government treatment arm, you actually do have more of a grievance to air than if you're in the NGO arm. That's something I hadn't really. That's a new point for me. Yeah. Yes, like I said, everything that I've showed you since the treatment effect equation, any critiques about endogeneity you want to make are fully taken on board. But even if you want to give it a causal interpretation, you're hinting at a different causal interpretation than the one I was giving. So that's interesting. I have to think about that. I don't have an immediate answer. Okay, let me quickly go through the geographic heterogeneity stuff. I already showed you we're scattered across the country. If you look, we're going to focus on 3 dimensions of baseline heterogeneity: pupil-teacher ratios at baseline, geographic density. This is how many schools are within a 5-mile radius of your school. We think this proxies a little bit for the density of the teacher labor market and how easy it's going to be to recruit teachers. And then baseline test scores. If you look at the little bit of our sample that's in Western Kenya that overlaps with the Duflo et al. Study, you see that Western Kenya is a little bit different on each of these. The baseline scores are a bit higher. Really not the way I remembered it. That's certainly what I found. Let's see if my next slide agrees with that. The geographic density has almost the exact same mean, but there's much less variation. And the baseline test scores, sorry, was I calling that a score? That's why I was confused. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm not going crazy. Baseline PTR was a bit higher in Western Kenya than the total national distribution. Baseline test scores are a bit lower in Western Kenya than the national distribution. I'm not going to walk you through it all, but just to go through the results quickly. So we interact each of these things with our treatments. Does the impact vary across these dimensions? The geographic remoteness, there's just no sign of heterogeneity in the treatment effects. The initial pupil-teacher ratio, again, no signs of heterogeneity whatsoever. The initial test scores throw up a negative sign on the interaction that's only significant in the government subsample. If we try it with lagged KCPE scores, the national exam scores, it disappears. So it's not a terribly robust finding. It's half of our sample and somewhat non-robust. But fine. If you want to take that at face value, then because baseline test scores in Western are about half a standard deviation below the mean, apply that to the heterogeneous treatment effects, it would mean that the government NGO gap in Western would have been about 0.05 standard deviations narrower. We have about a 0.2 standard deviation gap, and about 0.05 of that would have gone away if you'd only looked at Western, if you take these results very seriously. We interpret that, getting to the conclusions, on the geography and the heterogeneous treatment response. There's some signs that the intervention is quote-unquote progressive. The schools that start off performing more poorly, observationally equivalent to saying there's some reversion to the mean in the sample. But beyond that, there's very little reason to question the external validity in a geographic sense of results from Western Kenya when talking about Kenya, confirming the priors of the economists on the team, but useful in talking to the ministry. Institutions of partner selection bias. In this horse race, we saw the institutions mattered a lot. And some of that was things like local nepotism in the government sector that we think are independent of the scale. I mean, I don't have, again, evidence for this. This is just how we interpret our findings. I'd say some of those things are independent of scale. They're more about who you're working with. Other things, I haven't introduced the term seesaw effects. I won't do it now. But some of these relate more to, we want to argue to scale per se, and the hint that government failure was a function of that scale. So the findings I showed you about union affiliation and salary delays, we think are much more about the national politics that a giant program unleashed. Lastly, I was sent a Word file yesterday that said my presentation should focus not on a specific evaluation, but on lessons for impact evaluation writ large. So I'll do one slide of that. One question that comes up immediately, I think, that we should have to address is the implicit critique of the external validity here itself externally valid? We've shown that one study didn't work when we took it to the government. We need to talk more theoretically about what that says, if anything, for the external validity of other interventions and other impact evaluation findings. In the write-up of the paper, we make a distinction between external validity and construct validity. I think it's easier to organize thoughts if you think about external validity of our geographic heterogeneity points being external validity issues, and our main findings being about construct validity. In the kind of Shadish, Campbell, and Cook kind of classic textbook language, the construct validity is what is it that your treatment, how do you define your treatment? What did you think you delivered to these schools? And there's a tendency in the development econ impact evaluation literature to talk about interventions, to define them at the school, at the clinic, at the farm level, and not to define the intervention as a government policy or an NGO program. We define our interventions at a very narrow scope. And the question here is, was this a contract teacher intervention, or was this a government contract teacher program and an NGO contract teacher program? An important point, I think, to make in the RCT wars and methodology wars, nothing I've said so far is in any way unique to randomized controlled trials. This is a function of doing impact evaluations of small-scale programs and extrapolating to larger scale or government programs. I'm all for randomization. There's no reason we need to abandon internal validity in our pursuit of external validity. And lastly, these are thought questions we can come back to if we have time. Where do we go in terms of working with NGOs? And I think two very different ways of thinking about working with NGOs. One is our typical tendency, I think, is to use them as a laboratory to test things that we want to recommend. But I'm doing work with NGOs in West Africa in the criminal justice system where NGOs play a very different role of accountability for the public sector. And so, after this paper, we've had some conversations about could World Vision and the ministry have a very different relationship where World Vision doesn't implement in parallel, but World Vision is there to be them, do what they did apparently well, which is to monitor and regulate what the government's doing in its own programs. I'm not sure the ministry is going to sign up for that, but we don't necessarily have to make this a horse race. All right, let me stop there. I've gone too long already.
Yeah, thank you, Justin, for that presentation. As Justin alluded, I've actually sort of been watching or advising this project for about 4 years, so it's actually very nice to see it come to this level of fruition. And I've really kind of grouped my comments into 3 parts. There's what I like about the paper, one very specific suggestion for improvement, and then some more general thoughts about implications for this paper for the sorts of things we do here at IFPRI. In terms of what I like about the paper, I wrote down the words a lot, and underlined a lot twice. So you should take that as a good sign. First of all, obviously, it's clearly a very interesting question. The econometrics are carefully done done throughout the paper. For those of you who want like a template of how you actually present results from a randomized evaluation, this is a really good one to follow. because you do a very nice job not only of outlining the intervention itself, but explaining actually how it was implemented in practice. On that, there's a kind of an element or a flavor in the discussion where you seem somewhat apologetic about the fact that implementation is less than 100% or less than what was always set out in the original plan. And I think actually you should be less apologetic about that than you are. If you have a randomized controlled trial and everything is perfectly implemented, the chances of that being replicated at scale or in real life are so low that it actually, I think, instinctively causes you to question the external validity. But I think the fact that you can actually say, look, there were some deviations from this, but they weren't deviations that were sufficiently large to matter, actually makes the study more powerful. We also do a really nice job of explaining, looking at randomization and balancing, presenting the basic results. And although you didn't have much time to talk about it here, there are a lot of really nice tests of robustness as well as tests for heterogeneity. So all of those things I thought were really good, really strong about the paper. My suggestion for improvement goes like this. When I started off reading the paper, I noticed in the beginning there's a lot of reference to Duflo and Dupas and Kramer and others. I think there might be 12 references in the first 2 or 3 pages. And even here you referenced a lot of their work and also the issue of internal and external validity as a motivating device. When I began reading the paper, I had a good idea. By the time I got to the end, I actually thought it was not a good idea. And I think I have a suggestion as to how you could change this. And the change actually requires a short digression. One of the things you mentioned just in passing at the beginning of your presentation is you said, well, this issue of contract teachers is an issue not just in Kenya or in developing countries, but also in developed countries, including, as it happens, the United States. And it turns out there's actually a really very interesting NGO in the United States called Teach for America. And what this NGO does is it literally places contract teachers in poor performing schools. What makes them very interesting as an NGO is they monitor very closely the performance of the contract teachers they put in. And they've been doing this long enough that they alter their hiring criteria as the years go by, trying to pick up what were the characteristics of people which they knew ex ante, which actually were then correlated with performance after a 2-year teaching position. And I wrote down the first 4 characteristics, which they now identify as their top 4 criteria for hiring people. The first one is a very high commitment to education and to teaching children. The second is the demonstrated ability to motivate others. The third is being able to show achievement in academic endeavors or possibly extracurricular efforts or possibly volunteer efforts. And the fourth one is the demonstrated perseverance in the face of challenges. Now, what's really interesting about those characteristics is there's actually very little about formal teacher training or skill or even formal academic skill in itself. And so in fact, you noticed, and you actually made this note, when the government was hiring the teachers, they actually put a lot of weight on some of those kind of as were observable characteristics, like having a post-secondary degree for education. If I think of these 4 characteristics, what seems to me is that there is one characteristic which is about inducing effort in others, that is the motivating others, motivating children, and 2 which are all about, in effect, a signal of your ability to actually exert effort in the classroom. And that was the commitment to education and the perseverance in the face of challenges. So with that idea in mind, it seemed to me that a more interesting way of actually framing the paper is to actually say that what you're doing fundamentally is you want to estimate an education production where, in effect, there are 3 inputs. One input we could just describe as school characteristics generally. And of course, when you do things, for example, like your regressions with like school fixed effects, you just take care of those right away. A lot of people put a lot of emphasis on these things, but the evidence seems to suggest to us that, in fact, those actually are relatively unimportant in terms of their impact on these schooling outcomes. The other 2 inputs are effort by students and effort by teachers. For those of you, of course, since we've all been in school, we'll have actually encountered having good teachers and bad teachers. So there's also something intuitive in that, in terms of us just thinking about them based on our own experience. And for those of you who have children, say high school children, for example, I'm not thinking of anyone outside the Hobnot household, clearly effort that students exert also clearly has an effect on their grades. What you do in this framework, if you think about these 3 inputs, is that your intervention is basically through randomization, you're shocking the effort which is provided by teachers at the school level by introducing these contract teachers who, for the reasons you describe, you perceive will exert higher effort. And at your comment at the end when you're talking about construct and external validity, you're saying, what is it you're actually delivering through this intervention? My interpretation is that is actually what you're doing through the intervention. What makes this interesting, okay, is we start off with this general notion that basically these contract teachers are individuals who will exert higher effort. But through the mechanisms you describe, there's heterogeneity within them, in the sense that some of those people we perceive are going to exert effort actually don't, such as those who, in some sense, are captured by the union, or perhaps individuals who perceive they got this job because they were a friend of somebody else on the staff, feel that they don't need to exert effort in order to perform. They don't need to exert effort in order to retain their jobs. It also, of course, then explains why some of your other results and some of the other crosscuts don't matter so much. So you think of you have a discussion, as of others, about things like training people on how to run school committees. But if those school committees have very little ability to affect effort in the classroom, you wouldn't assume they would necessarily have much in the way of an impact on these outcomes. So I think reframing it in terms of this education production function, I think, in a sense, would be a more interesting way of motivating the paper. I don't think it actually causes you to change any of your results, but I think it actually gives it a much stronger sort of theoretical basis, and in a sense also reads much less as a response to Duflo and others, and much more as an interesting set of results in its own right. I also thought about this in terms of its implications for IFPRI, and I could actually think of 2. One of which, of course, relates to our own hiring practices. And for what it's worth, in fact, at least in PHN, we've actually been quite influenced by this Teach for America model. And that although we look for certainly minimum levels of academic achievement, depending on, and those vary, of course, depending on the position we hire, but we also do put a lot of weight on evidence that, in fact, that people have shown perseverance in the face of challenges, or that they clearly show a lot of motivation for this work and actually can demonstrate that. And certainly once you've got people above a certain threshold, we're certainly quite willing to trade off, in some sense, someone who might look like in a pure academic sense, the better econometrician or the more sophisticated modeler, against someone who basically clearly has a lot of motivation and can exert a lot of effort. So that's just one interesting thought. It will explain, if any of you have ever been in the PHN job seminar, why we ask people, tell us about the worst experience you've ever had and what you learned from it, right? Because it's trying to get at this idea of perseverance in the face of challenges. 2 other observations, one of which, and you, I think, really brought this out quite nicely, is the following, is that when we think of actually offering policy suggestions or policy advice, what we are doing, as do Duflo in their original study, is we're actually making very strong ceteris paribus assumptions. We're saying that, in fact, the world works this way. If you make this one change, we believe everything else will hold constant, and you'll get this better outcome. Well, this is a really good example, in fact, that these ceteris paribus assumptions are actually, once we move away from our models and our econometrics, in some sense, out into the real world, that, in fact, these are actually very strong assumptions. And in your particular case, that actually clearly played a role. In fact, it wasn't just one thing that changed, it was a lot of things that changed at the same time. But we can also, of course, turn this around and use it in a more positive way, which is to say, thinking that there might actually be a whole series of changes that occur based on this one suggestion or idea we have. What is it that we can do in terms of the presentation of our results or the information that we collect, which actually could then actually motivate actors to actually adopt these changes in such a way, but without taking up or adopting other changes which defeat them. So one interesting idea I was thinking about in the context of your study was something along the lines of yardstick competition, where, for example, you could think if you had this nice model, nice piece in the paper where you talk about primary schools which are in close proximity to each other. I can't remember your radius, like something like that. Well, you could imagine, in effect, an exercise where you publicize achievement rates on various learning tests. And possibly you publicize measures of effort. So you think, for example, of something where not only do you have people doing random spot checks on teacher attendance, but you publicize that and you also publicize, for example, test results. That what you're doing is, in effect, I would like to put some positive spin, you're actually sort of recognizing strong performers, which politically might be the nice way of phrasing it. But of course, what you're also doing is showing where, in fact, there's actually a lack of effort as a mechanism by which you can hope, in fact, the effort would then be increased. The final observation relating to IFPRI is in terms of our own research program. It seems to me that we spend a lot of time thinking about, as it were, technical issues and technical solutions, but we don't think so much about, as it were, what is actually in some of these underlying production functions. So to take one example is we spend a lot of time talking about, let's say, developing or disseminating new crop varieties. We assume oftentimes that that will be done through the public sector and extension agents. But we never really stop to think, well, why would an extension agent actually want to undertake this activity? And why might some be more willing to do so than others? And yet that's clearly going to be a key part of this dissemination story. To take a second example, which is certainly pertinent in my division, is we spend a lot of time thinking about new things that health extension workers should actually be doing in terms of providing new information to mothers, additional ways in which they should be reaching out to people, and so on and so forth. Our assumption is, in fact, implicitly, is that these people are kind of sitting around doing nothing, and if they just did a little bit more of this, they could actually achieve some results, for example, in the area of child nutrition. When in fact, these people are already incredibly busy as it is, and you're asking them to do one more thing on top of that. And then you're perhaps surprised when they don't, or they don't do it at the level of effort that you think is required. So I think one of the things more generally, which I think comes out of this paper, which then hooks back to my suggestion for remotivating it, is this idea of actually looking at these outputs, whether they're education outputs or health outputs or agricultural outputs, but putting a lot more attention to the notion of what is it that drives effort and what are the sorts of shocks or improvements we can make, which actually will encourage people to produce higher effort and therefore higher outcomes.
Great, thanks, John. Justin, do you want me to moderate questions, or do you want to do it yourself? I don't. Okay, why don't I let you go ahead? Yes.
So the bar chart that I showed, the 0.18 standard deviation effect was, oh, yeah, sorry. the 0.18 standard deviation effect was comparing the NGO treatment arm to the control group. And the little negative bar in the government was comparing the government treatment arm to the control. So using both of those relative to the control group. Correct. NGOs performed better, but certainly not perfectly. Part of the story would also be, this cuts both ways. As I mentioned briefly, and I didn't present results from it, we had two treatment arms within the government and within the NGO, which was that the NGO pays you directly versus the money goes into the school bank account and the school management committee is just to pay you. The delay, I don't observe where the delay happened. It could have happened at the school level. The school management committee could have pocketed all the cash for all I know. I mean, I do know something about that, but yeah. So yeah, the delay could be down there at the school level. Yeah. Yes, I should talk more about the test, but this is, a standardized total score across these two subject exams that we gave.